Shrieks and screams sounded through the night, as the people cowered away and ran amok. Perilous were those who slept too heavy or out of reach, for the night called out in terror, yet they answered to no such call. Their bodies reduced to ashes by morning. Likewise was the fact that those who fought back, for their swords were too small, and their bones were too brittle. With her eggs stolen, the dragon was more violent and ferocious than ever before. Her flames incinerated every house in the village, while her teeth ripped to shreds the livestock that couldn't run away fast enough. And by the time her carnage was over, there was nothing left. With 3 villages decimated in just a week, the king's efforts to slay the dragon ever expanded and intensified. Consequently, he called forth and recruited 100 men from the various villages and towns of his kingdom. If they were to kill the dragon, 100 shillings would be rewarded to each of the survivors. With that, a young peasant decided that he was tired of being a shepherd, so he sold his sheep and volunteered to join the king's army. Yet the boy was not strong nor tall. He was not loud nor mean. He was not handsome nor charismatic. He was not, by any means, what would one look for in a warrior. Nonetheless, he joined the army and attended the training. Here his comrades battered, bruised, and belittled his soul. They called him weak and small. They laughed at his attempts to wield a sword, for he could not barely swing it. They bullied him for his inability to march, for he was out of time. They pushed him around and hit him up good, simply because it was easy. Yet, by the end of the day, the shepherd's spirits remained high. He said to himself, "They will meet their fate, and I will meet mine." And so the shepherd smiled in the face of such misery. The following day, the commander told the shepherd, "You're not cut out to be a fighter. You'll be driving the supply carriage instead. We leave at dusk." The shepherd smiled and nodded, as if he'd just been complimented. Returning to his tent, the shepherd noticed that all of his money was gone, since he knew that any attempt to track down the culprit would be met with either mystery, lies, or violence. He simply said to himself, "They will meet their fate, and I will meet mine." And so the shepherd smiled in the face of such misery. Dusk came, and 100 men equipped their heavy iron armour and swords, left the camp and ventured onward to the dragon's lair, with the shepherd riding in the rear end of the group, both without armour and without a sword. By midnight, they arrived at the foot of a large rocky mountain where the dragon's lair was located on a small plateau near the peak. The commander yelled out, "We climb!" The army screamed with glory and climbed fervently towards the dragon, and of course, one soldier stayed behind long enough to push the shepherd off of the supply carriage, spit in his face, and say, "Loser." He then chuckled, yelled out with glory, and joined the rest of the army. The shepherd wiped the spit from his face, stood up, and said to himself, "He will meet his fate, and I will meet mine." And so the shepherd smiled in the face of such misery. The dragon's roar erupted like a clap of thunder, while her flame shot into the air with the brightness of 1,000 bolts of lightning. The horses reared and neighed in fear, but the shepherd simply patted them softly, soothed them with a quiet state of serenity. The soldiers climbed with every ounce of their being, but their armour was too heavy and their swords too awkward. One by one, they were incinerated and ripped to shreds, leaving nothing but a trail of moonlit armour and dead bodies. With a single tear trickling down his cheek, the shepherd could not bear such a horrifying sight. However, a silly idea struck the shepherd, and he said, "They have met their fate, and now I will meet mine." He then ran to the back of the carriage and grabbed a large slab of beef. Swinging it over his shoulder, the shepherd then slowly and calmly walked towards the mountain and began to climb. Although the sight and smell of the 99 dead men pierced his soul with anguish, he climbed upwards with a determined gleam in his eyes and an unwavering pace in his step. Unhindered by the heaviness of armour nor the awkwardness of the sword, he set foot upon the plateau. The dragon sat a mere 20 yards away with her back facing the shepherd. Here she calmly gazed up upon the stars with an apparent longing in her eyes, glittering magnificently in the moonlight. Her scales seemed, to the shepherd, to be stars themselves, and he wondered why such a beautiful creature was so unrelentingly vicious. The shepherd made a noise to alert the dragon of his presence, and he was met with that very same thunderous roar and blazing fire. He then kneeled down and held the meat up high atop his palms. When the dragon turned around, she almost seemed taken aback by the gesture. No human ever brought her food before. With suspicion in her footsteps, she hesitantly approached the shepherd, who remained calm, quiet, and still. Finally, she gently took the meat from the shepherd, turned around, and returned to her spot. The shepherd, still with that very same quiet calmness, stood up, walked towards her, and sat down beside her, gazing up at the stars, and patting her side. The kingdom was his. Fear is the path to the dark side. Fear leads to anger. Anger leads to hate. Hate leads to suffering. Yoda. Yes, even Star Wars contains useful philosophical thought, as do most films. This quote, in particular, is reminiscent of Buddhist thought. Indeed, the Dhammapada, a collection of the Buddha's sayings, the 3rd, 4th, and 5th verse, read as quoted. He reviled me, he struck me, he defeated me, he robbed me. They who fuss themselves up for this, for them hatred is not quelled. He reviled me, he struck me, he defeated me, he robbed me. They who do not fuss themselves up with this, for them is hatred quelled. Not through hatred is hatred quelled, whatever the occasion here. It is by the absence of hatred that they are quelled. This is an ancient truth. We live in a terrifying world. From the moment we are born, the dragon, that is death, stands just inches away, sharpening its teeth and waiting patiently for our final day to come. With such a gruesome fate, the human being is left absolutely terrified of death, and thus attempts to avoid it at all costs. Our fears lead us to wear heavy armour, which exhausts and weighs us down, day by day. Such exhaustion leaves us to become angry and resentful, and thus we wield large, awkward swords, carrying them everywhere we go. Then, over time, as death takes, one by one, the lives of those that we love, our anger and resentment brings us to a state of absolute hatred. As such, we flail and swing our swords at every which way, until, finally, our bodies ache, our hands are blistered, our armour is dented, and our swords are dulled. Despite all our armour, and despite how large our sword was, and despite how much and how hard we swung it around us, in the end, we fall to the ground and give up. And so, the fire erupts from the dragon, and we are inevitably taken by death, having lived a life filled with fear, anger, hatred, and above all, suffering. It does not have to be this way. The 39th verse of the Dhammapada states, "No fear is there for the wide awake who has mind undamped and thought unsmitten, the wholesome and the detrimental left behind." Indeed, the mind is a garden, and if one is unaware of that which grows within their garden, fear, anger, hatred, and suffering may sprout as weeds, overtaking and overwhelming the entirety of the garden. Thus is the case for those whose conflicts remains unquelled, and their thoughts a storm of suffering. Therefore, if one wishes to keep a beautiful and serene mind, the Buddha teaches that they must remain wide awake and watchful of that which grows within their garden, tending to it in every way possible. However, there are certainly parts of the garden that cannot be tended to, such as the inevitability of death. One does not, however, need to worry about such parts, or as the Dalai Lama says, tend to the part of the garden that you can touch. In Buddhist philosophy, such tending to the mind is achieved through meditation. Meditation is the practice by which the meditator trains themselves to be more aware of and concentrated upon the present moment and the mind. To that regard, it is the act of controlling one's own mind. With such practices, daily stresses, fears, and annoyances pass through the mind only as visitors, leaving one to actively focus on the present moment, and thus be entirely enveloped within it. In other words, the meditator is wide awake, and thus entirely and absolutely fearless. Indeed, the fearless wear no armour and swing no swords. They merely smile and nod in the face of despair, enjoying the subtle pleasures of life, and knowing full well that their fate shall come. For now is now, and then will be then. As such, they are not victims of the tyranny of death, but rather the masters of the sanctity of life. However, such practices are extremely difficult to undergo, or as quoted in the verse 163 of the Dhammapada, easy to do are things not good, and those harmful to oneself. But what is beneficial and good is exceedingly difficult to do. Indeed, many of the things that are easy to do in one's life end up hurting in the long run. For instance, it is quite easy to be distracted by one's cell phone while driving, thus being caught in a head-on collision that results in death. This is, of course, an extreme example, but a sound and not uncommon one, at the very least. Temptations are extremely easy to give into, just as staying focused and unmanipulated by such temptations is extremely difficult to do. As such, temptations and cravings lead to suffering. To that regard, the 359th verse of the Dhammapada states, "For the fields, grasses are the undoing, for humankind, longing is the undoing. Hence, to those free from longing, what is given yields much fruit." In fact, the Buddha claims that desire is the root of all suffering. Eliminate desire, and you eliminate suffering. One who has eliminated such desire from the self has attained what the Buddhists call nirvana, which is the relinquishing of the self, the ego, and thus the annihilation of all suffering. In the state of nirvana, the awakened one is enveloped in pure and utter happiness. Now, the Buddha claims that there are four noble truths. These are: 1. Suffering is inevitable, for it is part of life. 2. Desire and attachment are the root of all suffering. 3. It is possible to escape suffering. And 4. To relinquish the self and to eliminate suffering and desire, one must follow the Eightfold Path. This path is as follows: right action, right speech, right livelihood, right mindfulness, right effort, right concentration, right view, and right intention. Right action is acting in such a way that one does not hurt others or themselves. Right speech is speaking both truthfully and skillfully, that is, one speaks the truth, but not too bluntly nor too ignorantly. They know when, where, and how, and whether or not to speak. Right livelihood is living a pure and bliss life, one that does not cause harm or suffering to other people. Right mindfulness is being aware of the emotions, feelings, and intentions of the self and others. Right effort is actually taking the time, effort, and discipline to go about the Eightfold Path. Right concentration is the ability to stay focused on the present moment and thus having the ability to meditate. Right view is having the understanding that our actions, intentions, and desires have consequences, and thus one must stay focused and aware of all that one does and speaks. Finally, perhaps one of the most important parts of the Eightfold Path is right intention. If one wishes to relinquish suffering and learn the ways of the Buddha, they must fully know why they want to follow such a path, and whether this reason is a sufficiently virtuous one. As such, the Eightfold Path is the path towards enlightenment, or as the 289th verse states, knowing this fact, the wise one, restrained by virtue, would make clear, quite quickly, the path leading to nirvana. If you eliminate your attachment to this body and this mind, becoming fully aware of your surroundings and the inner self, and letting your spirit align with the very rhythm of reality, suffering shall forever be relinquished from your soul. Thus are the teachings of the Buddha. I leave you with 103rd, 4th, and 5th verse of the Dhammapada. He, truly, is supreme in battle, who could conquer himself alone, rather than he who would conquer in battle 1,000 men. Better, indeed, oneself conquered rather than these others. Of a person who has won himself, who is constantly living in self-control, neither a god nor soul, nor death itself, together with the creator of all gods, could turn the victory into death, into defeat of a living being like that.